Although many 112 and family office investors are interested in deploying catalytic capital, our internal research has uncovered some barriers to do so more than they currently do. In this lesson, we will explore these barriers and how to overcome them. We have learned that this can be grouped into three types really: structural, analytical, and perceived. Structural barriers involve setting up a portfolio and managing returns. This often consists about defining a portfolio for catalytic capital or integrating catalytic investments into an existing portfolio, defining allocation and managing returns. Analytical barriers include building capacity for catalytic capital, for deal origination and evaluation, whether this is done with internal or external resources, such as to perform due diligence, impact management, and monitoring, but also to establish an internal framework to decide when catalytic capital is deserved and appropriate in an investment. Perceived barriers are those that prevent investors from even considering catalytic capital investments. They may also be described as psychological barriers or hesitations. Several of these are typically societally conditioned. They might be reinforced by traditional investment beliefs or intermediaries, such as traditional wealth advisors, who may have a knee-jerk exclusion for anything that is sub-commercial, notwithstanding the impact of the investment or the value that it brings for their client, or by an undue comparison to traditional investing peers who may be primarily focused on commercial and financial returns. If any of these perceived barriers resonates with you, you may ask yourself if any of these responses are really yours, or they may be an unwelcome inheritance from traditional financial beliefs. In the next couple of slides, we will explore these barriers, but we will really spend most of our time on the perceived barriers because really they are the necessary condition to even considering catalytic capital. We will introduce structural and analytical barriers in the next two slides, but we will describe them in greater detail in the following modules. But for now, let me really lead with the conclusion first. None of the barriers that we will introduce are unsurmountable. A few words about the structural barriers. We have learned in our focus group that HNI investors and family office investors include catalytic capital investments as a part of a broader portfolio that is primarily market rate. After a process of defining how much of the portfolio is required to deliver market rate returns for them and for their families, investors integrate catalytic investments in a sub-portfolio or almost as an asset class with different returns and impact expectations than commercial investments. This enables them not to be constrained by the financial returns for a defined portion of their wealth, and they can quantify exactly how much they intend to deploy in catalytic capital and maybe also by when. This is usually achieved in two ways. One is to segregate a catalytic portfolio to be totally separately managed. Investors can determine a separate amount of capital that does not need to generate commercial returns, and they can manage it as a dedicated portfolio. In some instances, this portfolio may also be managed through a separate vehicle or legal entity, or even a foundation. And in the United States, investors might use the donor advised fund. The other approach is to gradually integrate catalytic investments into an existing portfolio and to manage it as a moving target. In other words, the investors will tune the dial on financial risk and return profile of their portfolio to their evolving constraints. This often starts with adding one or two catalytic investments to a commercial portfolio and then considering next steps from there. Many high net wealth and family office investors face a limited capacity to analyze and evaluate catalytic investments, and they may also lack an internal framework to decide which investments are truly worthy of their scarce capital. We broadly define these type of constraints as analytical barriers. With respect to sourcing and analyzing catalytic capital deals, it may be easier to collaborate with others. We will recommend identifying other key players and catalytic capital providers, learn about their investment thesis, maybe find peers that share the same vision, impact, outcome, objectives, and collaborate with them, maybe identifying companies and due diligence. For instance, C3 is building an online community that already has a LinkedIn presence, but also within Tonic, you can identify other catalytic capital investors and investment opportunities. One of the goals after this training course is to bring together a discussion group on catalytic capital investments within Tonic. We have also learned that having a proper evaluation framework to assess if and why catalytic capital is needed is another important barrier to overcome. This comes down to the decision about which investments deserve catalytic capital. The goal here is to assess the investor contribution and to evaluate if the same outcome could be achieved without an investment. Estimating if a specific impact outcome can be achieved thanks to an investment is often referred as counterfactual impact, with what likely happens in a world in which this investment is not made. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect because in order to evaluate the counterfactual impact, you should be able to compare what would have likely happened in a world where the investor takes an action, so the investment happens, with what likely happens in the world without that action, so where there is no investment. Given the difficulty in assessing these, in the next two modules, we will provide you with a set of guidelines to think about impact additionality as an investor, but also understanding the more nuanced impacts that you can have on your investment by, with your contribution. In this regard, we have also learned that having a clear evaluation framework will also help entrepreneurs and fund managers. If they can better justify and articulate their need for catalytic capital, it will be easier for them to raise capital from other investors. Catalytic capital is more scarce than commercial capital. And it is important for entrepreneurs to explain that they're not solely looking for a cheap investment because they have an inferior business model or fund, but rather it is compelling because of the unique impact that they can achieve thanks to this catalytic investment. Finally, let's turn to the third group, the perceived barriers. By labeling them as perceived, we don't imply that they're not real. We only imply that these are subjective barriers and they can be overcome by simply changing one's mindset. Not all of these are experienced by everyone, but they come up so often in our research that we believe that they are widespread among high net wealth and family offices investors. Many of these barriers can also be socially conditioned. For instance, traditional financial advisors will often advise against anything with sub-commercial returns, notwithstanding the values of their client that might lead them to consider such investment or the impact of these investments. Or they may also repeat outdated financial advice about maximizing financial returns at all costs to increase money available for grant making on the side and keeping the two things completely separate. So let's discuss some of these barriers one at a time. Traditional investors are often judged based on their financial performance against the benchmark. Impact investors can also feel the pressure to demonstrate that impact investing can deliver commercial returns by having to beat the market. Catalytic investors, on the other hand, seek investment that can deliver unique and distinct impact and in pursuit of outsized impact, and they accept the financial trade-off. Some investors may not even consider catalytic investments. Maybe investors' deal origination channels do not even surface catalytic capital investment opportunities, or such investments are not available on the platforms that traditional financial advisors provide them with. Investors may not know if their investment portfolio will generate enough income for their needs, and this might lead to a perception of needing to maximize returns above everything else. It is also common not to focus on the opportunity for investor contribution, because investor contribution is not a consideration of traditional investing. Many investors lack the instincts to evaluate whether their investment's capital can truly be catalytic. Some of these are learnable skills, which we will cover in the following modules, but some of it's about adopting a psychological mindset of looking for investor contribution and what you can bring to the table. With each of these, we invite you to consider if any of these barriers arise from your values or they might be an unwelcome inheritance from a dysfunctional financial system. We at Tonic do not presume to tell you what is right or wrong or what you should do with your capital, but we believe that every impact investors might find it valuable to reflect on the following questions about their potential role in the catalytic capital ecosystem. First question we would like to ask you is whether you're trying to maximize financial returns above all. And if so, why? Is there a specific overall rate of return that you need at the portfolio level? Within that, do you have capacity to integrate some catalytic investments? The next question is whether you assess your success based on beating the market. And if so, are you using the right benchmarks? Can the additional impact generated by catalytic capital investments justify the investment in its own right? If you started measuring impact and tracking it, might that justify a financial trade-off? Are there any deals that you have passed on because of the financial profile was too weak, while the impact was potentially very high? Is there any way that you could have made it happen by looking at a different pool of capital or coming up with an innovative structure or thinking about the potential of your capital to recruit other investors? Is your investor reputation tied to financial returns? We have learned at Tonic that this might be a challenge, especially for those investors who aim to use their impact investments portfolio to demonstrate viability of impact investing based on its financial performance. For instance, this is a common instance when there are family members involved, and investors might want to bring along other family members by showing that impact investing can deliver outstanding returns. These investors may be subject to a social pressure to demonstrate outstanding financial performances and to reduce the skepticism against impact investing, which leads to disregarding catalytic capital investments altogether. If this is your case, have you considered segregating a pool of capital that has different demonstrational value, which is not based on the financial returns, but on the impact? Or maybe have you considered defining how much capital is enough for your needs or your family needs in order to free up extra resources for catalytic capital, philanthropy, advocacy, and other non-investment activities? And the next question is, when you screen companies, is your impact assessment limited to the company itself, or do you also consider your systemic impact? Is it possible that by taking a bit more risk early on, you may be enable success in changing an entire system that otherwise wouldn't be possible? And if any of these barriers resonate with you, you may start investigating them here.